have a Kleenex? Anybody have a Kleenex? Just my glasses are dirty.
Oh, John, I knew you were better.
Oh, you got a...
I might be here. Usually I keep one in here.
All right, if you don't know, use this horrible rag. It's all right. Okay, hi everybody. How is everybody's time? Okay, if anybody has not done the consent form, please let me know. Attendance is, and consent forms can come later. And we've got attendance, an attendance sheet going around. We also have Steve Reckschaffner in the second hour, and even I didn't fully realize that he was the inventor of the sport of border cross, and that makes games and video games and that discussion, which is where we're going to start today, even more interesting, I think. So I'm going to assume that nobody watched the live stream from Georgia Tech, which will be a good thing because I'm going to repeat some stuff. But if anybody did at the appropriate part of the class, which I will announce to you, you will have to disqualify yourself. And let me just make sure I've got the time always going. Okay. Today we are largely talking about freedom of expression, and a couple of small notes. News of the week is up, but is in a sloppy version because I'm really trying to get it up Wednesday mornings before class, but that means I can't make it all nice, so I'll do it later. But everything is there and all the links are there. They're just not embedded as I like having them. Any other questions about the course? You will see that I have an office and office hours on the new syllabus, and I intend to start those next week. But you can email me anytime, and we can figure out times to get together, whether it's during office hours or not. So I want to start where we left off 2 weeks ago, because your question really got me going, and the question that we were focusing on is, so what makes a game? And remember, we had created this distinction in terms of how intellectual property law treats games and video games. And we came to the tentative conclusion that it was the art, it was the writing, the usual stuff that brings copyright in to films and into television that also brought them into games. But when we look more deeply at it, and you know, the core question was, okay, but when is it a game for IP purposes and when isn't it? So I'm going to start off there, because it really fits in, as much as it's a follow-up, it actually fits in to the entire discussion today. So I referred to Bruce Boyden's paper, and that's the quote that was up. Actually, that was not the quote. There was a a general quote in the last set of materials, and I've drilled down further. So Boyden's point in his paper is games are not subject to copyright. Why are they not subject to copyright? And implicitly, is it correct that they're not subject to copyright and intellectual property law? His conclusion is that games should not be, again, we're not talking about video games, we're just talking about games, that games should not be subject to intellectual property, but he does the hard work of figuring out why. Because the reason games are not subject to intellectual property is lost in the mists of time. So I have distilled probably too much. I had like 3 pages of his paper redacted, and I've distilled it to 2 slides. And he concludes, and this paper was 2011, to date, intellectual property doctrine and scholarship has not really grappled with the slippery nature of games, which was your point. Indeed, copyright has developed a very simple black-letter rule to handle them. Games are not copyrightable. What could be the purpose of such a rule? That actually was part of the quote from last time, and that's where I left it. Boyden goes on to say, 2 possibilities emerge. First, several cases describe games and game rules as unprotectable ideas. Underline ideas in your head, please. The other possible explanation that emerges from the case law is that games are uncopyrightable systems or processes. So I know that sounds pretty esoteric. We'll be able to go there. There's an old case called the Seltzer case, and it's a very clever case. And a man by the name of Seltzer came up with the idea for roller derby and the rules of roller derby. And the legal doctrine is that you can't copyright rules and you can't copyright a game. So what he did was write a couple of works of fiction, stories, in which he incorporated the rules of roller derby. And the court said, nah, that isn't going to work. You can't copyright the rules of the game, even if you embed them in a work of fiction. So just to give you the background. Okay, so here's where I went. Because before I re-looked at Boyden, I was thinking obsessively about your question. And I wanted to come up with an obvious game that no one would say was protectable by IP. And I came up with odds and evens. And I assume everybody knows what odds and evens are. It's a way of settling a dispute or winning something. And it's just your fingers and my fingers. There's no game controller. There's just our bodies and the barest of rules. So Boyden, back to Boyden. He goes through the cases at length. This is a huge distillation, not a quote at the top. And he shows that the cases denied copyrights in 4 particulars. Systems for the presentation of information, systems that are expressly designed to allow others to organize information, systems of notation, contests, and betting systems. And now the key. In all of those cases, the owners of a copyright in a form, description, or set of instructions were attempting to extend their copyright to material for which the user of the work provided the essential content. So the key to Boyden's view is that games are systems, and systems are not copyrightable. Why? Because it's not the author alone. It's the author and the user. It's the dialectic. It's the back and forth, which is a key concept in the course. That is what made them systems. They were, without the user's input, empty shells waiting to be filled. When you make a design, when you make a game, you make it for the gamer. So Boyden's conclusion, games are systems in exactly the same way. A game as sold is only a game form. The content necessary for an instance of the game comes from the players. Please.
It's still operating as games as odds and evens, so that sort of game.
Yeah. Basketball. I mean, now we can actually, once we're here, you can start incorporating other things into the game. But that doesn't mean there can't be a trademark on the basketball. Systems are shells into which users pour meaning. So this is a core concept. So now I want to talk about, to try and clarify a little more, now we know that the reasons games don't have copyright protection, bare games, not video games, is because they are systems. So now let's just, as a review, and I'll come to your question in a second, go to what are the other possible reasons that confused us last time, and kind of let's name them and rule them out.
I'm not sure if that sounds right to me. I'm not sure if that sounds correct to me, just because, like, the idea can't be copyrighted because it's the expression someone else inputs that. But what about something like architectural blueprints? I mean, is there intellectual property in that? I'm going to assume yes. Is someone going to correct me? But that doesn't have expression until it's been developed, until the user, the constructionist, builds something out of it. I mean, it's just
that you're building it for people, and therefore, I'm going to assume it does. I'm going to check because I'm not completely convinced of that, and I don't know the intellectual property around. I don't know the intellectual property around buildings, and I suspect it's an area unto itself. But I do get your point, which is, hey, every television show is meant to be watched. So there is a level of interactivity. Every book is meant to be read. There's a level of interactivity in everything. But where, if that's a terrible example, so I won't use it, and I'm not going to make any gratuitous Miley Cyrus jokes. So another reason I won't say it. If a music video is not watched by anyone, it still exists. I guess the argument is that a game that's unplayed isn't even a game.
I imagine it goes somewhat on a scale in terms of the complexity of that original idea. I read your post on the website about video game engines, and I feel it's somewhat the same. So when he says that the game as a system
Yeah.
isn't copyrightable because it has no value until the user puts their content into it. It's sort of like the game of tag. When we think about tag, no one can really get anything out of the idea of tag until we play tag. And then the playing of tag is the value. But when you get into things that are more complicated, like architectural blueprints or like a video game engine, there's a degree of value in those structural skeleton things themselves. You can look at a game engine and see like, oh, this is like a really cool way of like setting up these different lines of code and like structuring information this way, or like setting up these beams for this architecture this way. So there is value you can take out of it, and that might be why the more complexity of
and the issue, in fact, we'll come to this in a little later in a slightly different context, but the issue as to whether code can be seen as literature is different than the bare issue, which you pointed us to, which is, okay, where is the intellectual property or not in a game itself?
Where would that fit in with like a assistant world RPG where no one might play it, but there could still be interactions between non-playable characters that might have emergent behaviour that could be quite interesting? Would that be copyrightable? Simulation might be.
Well, it's like a movie. So remember, the distinction that we're making is the game part and then the art and literature part, which is clearly copyrightable. So no one's questioning, like in Breakout, that the art and the sounds in a video game are copyrightable. The thing that we're focusing in on is the bare game. And does that attract intellectual property protection? Boyden says no, and Boyden says games are systems. Systems don't attract intellectual property. So bear with me for a minute. So we haven't talked about the idea expression dichotomy. We're going to talk a lot about it next week. But it's the notion that there is no intellectual property in an idea, and it's at the point of fixation, being the point of expression, that you get intellectual property. And that was the other nominee of Boyden's as to where you could, okay, games are an idea, and this is kind of where we got to last time, games are an idea, therefore no intellectual property. But we didn't feel comfortable with that, and you didn't feel comfortable with that because games seemed like more than an idea. There was a whole protocol. So Boyden says, not systems, that's why. Just wanted to do one other thing because we alluded to it last week, and that is maybe this has something to do with the various ways different kinds of IP overlap. And you can look at this slide on your own time, but it doesn't have to do with that. What it does have to do with, mention the magic circle, and we're kind of back to the magic circle. This magical place where you and I interact according to different rules. And the technical legal name for it, as boring as it is, becomes system. And that's really a version of what's going on. You can see a little bit more about magic circle. And then, of course, I couldn't resist. Boyden's paper is a US paper. What an awesome paper. How is Canadian intellectual property law and copyright law different? Track through Boyden, do a criticism of it, and track through whatever differences we may have in our law. So all of this is completely relevant, even though it's a bit of a bridge to last session, is really completely relevant to everything else we're going to talk about today. So this is where I took us to, and we're talking about expression and freedoms. And we're eventually bridging to next week, which is there and should there be a right to mod? Should there be a right to remix in a gaming context? So I'm going to ask you to do a quick exercise. And I'll explain why. But I'm going to want you, and I will define the terms for you, to do a little bit of introspection and decide whether you're a creator or a connector. Everyone is creative. There's no one in this room. There's no one in this law school. There's no one in this university. There's probably no one on this earth who is not creative, no matter what they may think of themselves. the question that I'm delving into is, how do you see creativity? So there's two modes. I made this up. There's the creator mode and the connector mode. So here's a quote that has to do with the creator. The creative is the place where no one else has ever been. You have to leave the city of your comfort and go into the wilderness of your intuition. What you'll discover will be wonderful. What you'll discover is yourself. That's the best quote I could find on creator. I should just note, no one is wholly creator or connector. I'm really asking, are you 50.1% more this way or that way? What's a connector? So here's the best quote I could find on that. Creativity is just connecting things. When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. That's because they were able to connect experiences they had and synthesize new things. So connecting is, it's all out there, and I've built a unique Lego piece, and I'm calling that creative. The creator meme is, it's coming from within me. It's utterly original. And people feel different ways. I've had classes recently, I just started doing this 2 weeks ago, that are 50-50. So I will ask again, a show of hands, and we'll start with connectors. Who thinks they're 50.1% or more connector? Okay. Who thinks they're 50.1% or more creator? Okay, so we have, interesting, this was roughly the same percentages at Georgia Tech. At the Center for Digital Media, it was more 50-50. So very interesting. So, and I should apologize. The reason these slides are so boring is because I'm trying not to tilt your opinion one way or another with color, and I'm trying to be as objective as I can. So let's a little more on connecting. So the quote I gave you was Steve Jobs in 1996. Doesn't really explain how we got Apple versus Samsung, but we'll just sort of skip over that for the moment. All creative work is derivative. That's probably the simplest form of it. And a good, serious conversation about it is Stephen Johnson. If you want more, you'll find a TED Talks from him on the web page under resources. The greatest driver of scientific and technological innovation in the last 600 years has been the increase in our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people. So that's connection. Creating is, the quote was from a mid to high level Hollywood director, producer, actor of some talent who I like quite a bit. And where does this come from? Well, our Western cultural canon is filled with creation mythology. I can also point out that our comic book canon is filled with creation mythology. The creation story is the staple of comics and now movies about comics. And it's in Genesis 1. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. It comes from me. We come from God. We are like God. It's a completely unique ownership experience. So where this goes is really more of a question than an answer. And you won't be able to answer it really until the end of the course. And that is how you feel about whether you're a creator or a connector. How does that inform how you feel about intellectual property law? Because if you're a connector, it seems logical that you would be more into remixing and building on the work of others and a little less property oriented. And if you're a creator, it's more understandable that you would have a sense of great property and that this came from within. Now, that argument exempts the economic arguments for copyright, et cetera, et cetera. So, and an interesting piece in this week's News of the Week on the economic arguments of copyright. So, I'm suggesting there's kind of an alignment and a tension. The Hollywood model versus the remix model, you can think of the remix model as the Silicon Valley model, too. So, those are kind of the two contesting memes. And I want to remind you, since we're here, that education is a really interesting example of where we are trying consciously to build knowledge. And what do we do? You know, if to the extent that any of you submit a paper at the end of this course, to me or anybody else, where you don't have citations and you're not consciously building on the work of others, you will be marked down. It's no surprise. Plagiarism, you get kicked out, so you can't plagiarize, but you have to cite and you have to build on the work of others. So where we really want to build knowledge, clearly in the educational system, it's interesting that we actually have a remixing model. The other one should be obvious to you. Now, this doesn't apply to statutory law, but the common law is exactly the same way. We build on citations. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And we build the Lego blocks of the law. So it is interesting that where it really, really matters, we tend to, as a society, structure remixing into the actual system. So now I want to go to freedoms. And all this will connect very shortly. If it is, it's already reasonably well connected. The charter, you know, and I just want you to focus in on the rights in the charter. Conscience, thought, belief, opinion, expression, press, media of communication. U.S., older Constitution, much older Constitution, no law abridging freedom of speech. So the permissive concept is speech. The right is speech. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you may say to yourself, why would you put in Article 18? That has to do with religion. It does. I put it in because of the rights-oriented words thought and conscience. And then Article 19 is more familiar to us, opinion, expression, and then an interesting concept, and probably the most useful one here, seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media. So a freedom related to ideas and to the expression of ideas. That's close to where I want to get to. Where's the freedom to create? If you want to have a right to mod, if you want to have a right to remix, where are you going to locate it? It's not as simple as speech, at least not overtly. And it's not quite, it doesn't quite fit into the Canadian rights words. Now, in the United States, there's a concept of unenumerated rights that's built into the Constitution. And that says there are rights that can come into existence, largely because they always were in existence, but you don't have to limit yourself simply to the notion of speech as a hard-edged defined term. In Canada, it's not completely clear to me exactly what we do with unenumerated rights. And it hasn't been a huge issue because of the relative recency of our Constitution. But now, in the digital world, arguably, it might or might not be nice to have a right to create. Now, having said that, are we really going to find the solution in rights? Rights are wonderful, and they're part of the Western canon for sure. They really load the debate. I do believe very strongly in rights, but they also are very polarizing. They bring in dogma. They bring in literalism. And I cite the case of Aaron Swartz, who is a brilliant young man of 21 who committed suicide last year because he was up for trial for downloading a huge amount of documents that were academic documents that academics were not compensated for and made freely available. And you know, you should look up the case if you're not aware of it. But the U.S. Attorney's Office issued a press release which embodied the literalism I'm talking about. And this was arguably a crime with no victim. And in fact, more than arguably so. But you'd have to do a bit of reading to truly understand it. Here's what the Crown said, or what we would call the Crown. Stealing is stealing, whether you use a computer command or a crowbar, and whether you take documents, data, or dollars. It is equally harmful to the victim, whether you sell what you have stolen or give it away. Really? When it comes to digital data? It's a stretch at the very least. Obviously, this has been hugely criticized, and if you want the best exposition on this case and this subject, you'll find a piece by Larry Lessig of Harvard Law called Aaron's Law in the materials section of the website. And it's absolutely awesome. And I do make it part of the syllabus towards the end. But take a look at it sooner. So you get into literalism. And literalism really slows down the process. And there's two kinds of literalism that we've seen over the last couple of years with respect to digital data. There's literalism around IP. So IP is property, or actually sort of the opposite meme, which is all information wants to be free. But it's really the intellectual property literalism that sticks out. And then there's privacy literalism. And it's interesting because, roughly speaking, those who believe very, very powerfully in privacy tend to believe less in intellectual property literalism, and vice versa. So many companies who really want your private data really protect their intellectual property rights very, very strictly. So there's a double standard that seems to be at play. There is a common denominator if you think about it. And it is this notion of those ones and zeros belong to me. So if you're looking for something that unites literalism around privacy and literalism around, say, copyright, it is, hey, that's mine. It's the Hollywood model. And there is an antidote to that. And we actually have the antidote in Canada, and we'll talk about it more at the end of the course. It's called moral rights. And moral rights is part of our intellectual property law. And it's got nothing to do with compensation. It has everything to do with attribution, the right to follow, and the right to say, hey, you can't do that with my stuff. You can't deface it in that way. But it's not a compensation concept. It's exactly what it sounds like, moral rights. So there may be some solutions there. Ultimately, this is a dialectic. Ultimately, this is going to be a back and forth that the law is going to be engaged in and is engaged in. Because we have to get beyond the war. And this is a sign that I saw on our summer vacation in the Okanagan, which to me embodies perfectly the notion of a dialectic, now serving dim sum sushi. So two totally different concepts belonging to different cultures, and we will mush them together and make peace with them. So how do we reconcile all of this? So ultimately, it's going to come down to, what do you think is more important to the human race? What do you think is more important to us? Is it going to be creativity or is it property? Because that's where the hard edges are here. Creativity, the remix meme is, hey, I can use anything as long as I'm doing something creative and adding to it in some way. Otherwise, it does become plagiarism. I think everybody acknowledges just usage in and of itself. Or it's property, belongs to me, doesn't belong to you. These are decisions you are going to make for yourself, trying to frame the argument. And one of the things that will be interesting is in the creator-connector exercise we did, is whether any of you change your mind one way or the other over the course of this semester. Which brings us back, sometimes it works too well, brings us back to video games. Video games, and brings us back to systems. And what is a game? Video games are the perfect metaphor here, and are one of the clearest loci for this debate. Why? Well, mutual reliance. You have merged creativity. You have the creativity of the creators of the game and the players. And the more multiplayer it is, and the more massive the world is, the more mutual reliance there is, and the harder it is to say, well, this is my creativity, not your creativity. And it comes back to the system, because there is no game if nobody's playing. Now, again, we're in video games, so there still is art. So looking at this question, of is creativity more important than property, video games are a really good way for you to answer that question for yourself. So next week we're going to talk about this in some detail, but right to remix, mod, create is what we're talking about. That's why we set the freedom of expression framework. And this really interesting balancing act where creators are users and users are creators. And what do we do about that? Because that is the reality of games. Now, buried at the bottom of the slide is possibly something quite important. And that is to distinguish in your mind the right to create as a creative right to what we currently have in intellectual property law, which are rights in the creation. Alienable, trackable rights in what's been created. These things get mashed together, and they're not the same thing. The right to create something and the right in what has been created are two different things, and the sooner you realize that they are clearly two different things, the more likely you are to come to some answers for yourself and write a great paper if you're tracking in this area. So I will come back to Grand Prix Legends because that's what I know. But this was the Honda, which wasn't even called the Honda. It was called the Morrisama because they didn't have rights from Honda. 1967 car, Formula One race car in the original version of Grand Prix Legends. And this is what the community made it look like within just a couple of years. So, and also even the backgrounds, you can see that's all community built stuff. Whose game is it? Oh, and this is not a criticism, but just a realistic point. Grand Prix Legends was horribly reviewed, lasted in the stores for just a matter of months, and actually the boxes were pulled back and sent back to Papyrus. When I wanted to get my first copy, I couldn't even get it because they had returned the games. And the developers are the top developers in the world today of racing games. Because they really did build a great game. It was too far ahead of its time. And they didn't have the development time to get it where it needed to go. So the community did that. But they still got the credit, and they still got the acknowledgement, and they still got the ability to go on and make the NASCAR series and now make iRacing. So the trade-off is not that bad. What do we have that's closest to a right to create? Obscenity. Right? That's the one area where we, and this is a wonderful book on the history, the judicial history of obscenity law in the United States as applied to literature. But it's the one area where we impose restrictions and we go, you know, the right to create, it's not enumerated as such, but the importance of creativity, and it is enumerated that way, is so critical that we're going to engage in this dialectic. Cases, I've given you a series of cases, and interesting paper that I alluded to earlier around data. And is data speech? And what implications are there to that? So this is around the freedom of expression around data. But that clearly has intellectual property implications as well. And then I want to talk about, anybody know what Uber is? Okay, so Uber, you want to tell us what it is and hit the button?
Yeah, sure. It's a car. It's like a car rentals, not rental service. It's a car
Taxi service.
Well, it's more like but it's an upscale taxi service, and it's sort of contractor based. So there's no central organization that hires drivers, rents cars, sets the drivers up with them. You basically opt in as a driver. If you normally have a town car and you drive people around and you have a couple extra hours, you opt into the service and it matches you with customers.
Through an iPhone app or an Android app. And so there's this great system. And when it was first introduced in 2011, I mean, Uber is succeeding today, but almost all cities have systems of regulating transportation, and in particular taxis. And there were many attempts in various different guises to outlaw Uber. And so you see this real clash that happens around expression and services and creativity and being able, this is real world plus a digital iteration of it, and it wouldn't be possible really to do without the digital iteration. It would be very, very sloppy if you were trying to do it over the phone. It just effectively would be a taxi service. And so we see constraints come in on creativity, and then we see what digital create. We see the debate and dialectic between digital creativity and those constraints, and then it resolves itself. And games are an obvious example, and more particularly, we're in the place where we have to ask ourselves what is the role of intellectual property as a constraint? What is the role of copyright as a constraint? Property or creativity? So now I just want to do one last slightly crazy thing. This is a piece done by the law librarian, if memory serves, at Duke University. And he noticed an interesting thing looking at the data, and that is that at the time, last year, around do I have a date? Yeah, December of 2012. So 9 months ago, 10 months ago. The economic data of strong countries tended to correlate with weak IP laws. Now, as we'll learn when we're looking at violence in games, correlation is not causation. So let's remember that. So this is just a very interesting correlation. I feel like there's something strongly missing here. Please.
Just out of curiosity, you've got Brazil, India, Russia, China there. Where's the U.S., Germany up there?
They're stronger IP laws, and at the time, weaker economies. Well, and still, I mean, Germany's a strong economy. The United States is, somewhere in the 15s, 20s, but not right at the top. And not all of these countries are still right at the top anymore. I think, I think there are some. India's slowed down. China, people are expecting a cliff, but it hasn't arrived yet. So, again, we're not dealing with with either perfect correlations, and we're certainly not dealing with perfect causations. But where I go with this is that there's something really missing here. And there's something that makes me very uncomfortable, and that is strong economies, IP laws. I get that. What about human rights? What about systems of justice? What happens if we introduce that into the mix as a factor? So I noticed that the latest, at least Canada's placement, was available 2 weeks ago at the law school, a couple of sheets from this wonderful piece called the World Justice Project. And I tried to correlate adding respect for fundamental rights into the mix, and came to this really interesting conclusion that if you wanted to do that, you do really well, basically, with the Nordic countries. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, highest rankings in open government last year. I haven't checked the World Justice Project for this year, but I can't imagine that they've fallen precipitously off the map. Very strong economically in 2012, and did superbly well in what seemed to be a respected global creativity index that we could find. So there may be a way. And so you start looking at where are the Nordic countries on intellectual property law, and they do have some. But they have intellectual property law, full stop, period. But they tend to have a stronger acknowledgement of users' rights, certainly than the United States, and not arguably, and certainly more than Canada had before the Supreme Court of Canada pentology of last August.
You're talking about the economy. Isn't there a really big difference between the BRIC countries that might have really big primary resource economies and something like the U.S. that has a ginormous creative property like Hollywood?
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're looking at economies, it's not unfair, and I'm not an economist, to argue, okay, what's the overall health of your country? So yes, there is no question that Hollywood is a strong export-oriented part of the U.S. economy, and is very, very assertive in the intellectual property sense, and very much has affected U.S. Copyright law, trademark law, patent law. We are seeing a backlash against that. But I don't think it's totally unfair to say, hey, let's look at the overall of IP laws, the overall of the economy, and the overall of the justice index, and figure out if you're a creator and you want to live in a civil society that has a healthy economy, where should you be? And tentative conclusion, it's, as I say, it's gotten Google. It'd be really nice to have somebody seriously look at it. But I was not satisfied with just this simple correlation between strong economy and weak IP laws, because I think that misses the boat. So next week, straight up, mods, which is remixing in games. So we are going to meet these subjects absolutely head on, and then we're finished the creating meme in the course, and we start talking about connecting, which is going to shock you in the amount of contract law it has in it, because it really ends up, connecting really ends up being about contract law in large part. Any questions before Steve and I do our fancy audio switch?
John, I just want one thing.
Please.
With your analysis relating to the world's index and everything, and it's always been a thought of mine that, like very, very early on, our education system plays a big part in this. And all of the countries that you listed all subscribe to the Scandinavian model of higher education.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, although this all seems to put really nicely together, and again, my sources are myself and Google.
Yeah.
But is it all possible that IP law has nothing to do with the strength of the economy, and we're looking at a deep-seated philosophical change in society that roots that?
That relates to education.
Education, I mean, that's just my thoughts about it, but it could be something else entirely.
Well, first of all of this is correlation, so it could clearly be something else either in your model or in what I'm suggesting. However, I'm going to go back to education as a remixing model, and I'm going to suggest, I think you're right, and I think education is a huge factor and maybe should be parsed out as a fourth factor that informs the other three. But the remix model in education, and if you look at, I don't know a whole lot, but something about the educational system in those countries, but also the educational system generally is a remix model and has definitely informed IP law in those Norwegian countries more than it has here. Here, the United States, and North America generally, the creative industries, being Hollywood until Silicon Valley came along, had a disproportionate amount of control over the fate of intellectual property law. That didn't happen in the Norwegian countries. And not that they didn't have great film directors, but the industry wasn't at that level. But so they went where they made other things strong. And education was certainly a big part of that. So I from what I've read, and I did a fair bit of reading on it last year to get to this place, a lot of what we think of as IP law in those countries has is greatly informed by academics. Not that it's not informed in North America, but and in the United States, but certainly not as greatly as there. So I actually think we may be saying the same thing.
I'm just wondering, when we're talking about creativity, are we talking about originality, or we're talking about copyright and other intellectual property protections? But are we using a standard of originality which doesn't necessarily rise to the level of creativity? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that standard, an exercise of skill and judgment, I think might be more and more important in a world that does have this type of remixing that doesn't necessarily involve creativity, depending on how we're defining the word, but create something original.
So let's use that as the perfect teaser to next week on mods, because that really is the issue. The issue is thresholds. We already saw in Atari and Oman that the threshold for intellectual property for copyright protection is very low. There's a debate, should it be higher? But there's another debate, which is the one you're really alluding to, which I think is the more meaningful one, is, okay, what is the threshold of originality that's required to remix something, to mod something? When does it become something new unto itself? Have I sort of got your question right? So that is the perfect teaser introduction for next week, because that's what next week's about. And I really want to go to Steve, and Steve will go to 12:20 and when the cameras shut down, and then we'll stay and take questions on either my part or his part. Come on up, Steve. Okay, this is Steve Rechtschaffner. I have posted his bio on the website. I just love the fact, and Steve, you don't really know this, but where a lot of today's class was the difference between what is a game and what is a video game in terms of intellectual property protection, because there isn't intellectual property protection in games per se. And we've already visited in the course the issue of sports versus games versus video games as a meme of the course, and the fact that you invented border cross, which I hadn't actually focused on, also is very interesting in that context.
Yeah, I learned a lot about copyright and trademark and patent and a whole wide variety of things back in the early 90s when I was just noodling around with that. I'm going to go.
Your camera is there, so if you're doing it off the board, this is the board.
Okay. That'll be in frame?
That'll be in frame.
All right. I'm going very low tech today. I have a very strong aversion to PowerPoint. And I use it actually as a tool to think through things, but when I start using it to try and present ideas, I actually spend all my time just trying to make it polished, and I forget about the value of the content, and it just becomes, I don't know, I just end up reading it. So in preparation for today, and I had some assumptions as to what I thought would be interesting to discuss, and bounced a couple ideas off John. I sat down and did a little whiteboarding for a couple hours yesterday at my home to see really what felt interesting. And what I'd like to get a sense of is, first of all, I'd like to make this a lot more interactive. Be easy for me. I could stand up here and talk for 6 hours, and that would be interesting for me, but I don't know that you get much value out of that. So, full disclaimer, I can talk forever. I'm easily entertained, especially if I'm talking. So, as a broad subject, and this is where I seem to be spending a lot of my time these days, it's looking at the worlds of games, and by games, I mean video games. I've never worked around board games. I don't like the term gamification. To me, if it's an electronic device of some kind and something's appearing on a screen and I'm interacting, in my mind, it's a video game. So probably not the best definition, but I did a workshop class with some high school kids, and we came up with this really fun game idea, which we called Assassin. And it really was just about taking your iPhone camera and putting a little scope on it and having friends. And the point of the game was you had to get close enough to your friends without them not knowing and shoot them with your camera. And they would know. And it was a really nice idea because they built a whole concept around it, and we got to talk about how do you spread it, how do you monetize it, how do you build it. But at the end of the day, because it was about live interaction, we said, is it a video game? It feels like it's tag. It feels like it's a game I would play, and this is just making it better or different. So anyway, I could get off on that topic. So as a broad approach, the things I was thinking about were the various game consoles and forms of entertainment that got us to today. And I'd love to summarize those and look for kind of key beats as to when these things really took a leap forward, but really just as a platform to talk about where do we think things are going, and to involve everybody here as much as possible to get your ideas and thoughts, because I have ideas and I'm quick to come up with a chief thesis, but I don't necessarily know that it's true, and I'd love to have people share their thoughts around these different areas and challenge some of these ideas to see where we actually collectively to some degree, can leave this room thinking we know where things are going. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? Because I don't have a crystal ball, although I tend to be really lucky at guessing things. So I'm going to just put a few marks in time to help us out. And I have the squeakiest shoes in the world. 94, 2004, 14, that kind of is where we are today. And I'll just put 3 years out past then, 2017. So I'm old, it's easy for me to remember where the world of gaming was in 1994. It's actually very easy for me to flash back there. I was working on one of my first video games called FIFA 95. And the platforms we were developing for were the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, the SNES, and PC. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember those, but there was a generation before that. There was the NES. So this wasn't the first generation. There was stuff going back. Commodore 64, all that stuff. But as far as mainstreaming and IP, this was, in my journey, kind of a key starting point. And the next leap forward from here, console-wise, was, and this kind of happened the next year, we saw the introduction of Sony into the market. Along came the PlayStation. Sega had a whole bunch of different platforms, none of which really worked very well, none of which had a big impact. And the interesting part here was this was all cartridge-based. And the only relevance that has is it was expensive. It was extremely expensive to make a cartridge. To give you an insight as to probably the most important thing I thought about as a game producer back in making FIFA 95, it was how big a cartridge can I afford? Because all your memory was in the cartridge. And so your cartridge is going to cost you $18, $16, $20, and for every little bit of memory you wanted to add, you had to justify being able to charge more money or sell a lot more games. So it was all, truly, it was about an exercise of efficiency. Because the memory was so small, if you wanted to put a little bit of voice in, you had to take some animations out. If you wanted to add a stadium that looked different because you needed the art assets in there, you had to take something. It was, and then really what constituted a great programmer at that time was somebody that could write incredibly efficient code that took up very little space. So along comes the PlayStation 1, and it didn't have the memory built in. The memory was built into the machine. So the big leap forward there, for me at least, was all of a sudden it felt like memory wasn't an issue. We had CDs. You know, wow, CDs. It felt like, I remember saying, this is unlimited storage. We're never going to fill this CD. What are we going to fill this with? This is crazy. You know, we could build real stadiums. And so at that time I was working on what became the first popular 3D sports games. We did that with FIFA. We were building a baseball game. But it was really the first 3D sports games. And we went hog wild. It was, we could build every stadium in Major League Baseball. Or we could build 20 great stadiums. Or we could have an announcer. And we could have extra phrases that we stream off the CD into the memory. And then to make it, you know, we said, well, it kind of sounds a little repetitive. Yeah, but we can dump that whole bank of speech and bring in another one because we have unlimited storage. Well, within 2 months, we weren't using the word unlimited anymore. We were right back to the same constraints. It was like, oh, well, you know, we can only fit in 16 stadiums. That's you know, we want every stadium. We want historical stadiums. So it was really fun because it was a leap forward. And it was interesting because we really freaked out the Sony people because they didn't imagine, they imagined You had a CD, and you had a CD reader. You'd start the game, it would read the information once, and then the reader would go to sleep. No. For us, it was like you could hear. The big problem was we'd burn them out because we'd constantly be streaming stuff into the game. New sound, new animations, things to make it feel more real. So you'd hear this thing, and they were getting a lot of PlayStations returned because all of a sudden these readers were getting burnt out because they were never meant to go full-time nonstop. So the interesting breakthrough really was the idea, it was a paradigm shift for designers and developers that we could have a much greater asset base of animations, of art, of voice, whatever we wanted, and we could bring it in and bring it out at any time we wanted to make the experiences feel more organic. So these are platforms, PlayStation, PC games back then. Any idea what PC games were like back then? Yeah. Well, so one of the things to consider was, I'm going to run out of room really quickly here, but business models. So the business models that surrounded all these were pretty straightforward. How did you buy them? You just paid money. Same with PC games. You know, and the funny part was PC games used to come in these big boxes, and by the time, you know, when they moved to discs, you'd get a big box, and it was always really disappointing when you'd open it up because you'd have like 3 discs in a giant box and like a little shitty manual. You go, what's with the big box? And the big box was all about retail shelf space. And plus, they were expensive. You wanted to feel like you were getting something for your money. Anyway, so we jump forward a little bit, and we start moving in. Let's see, Nintendo, yeah, there was, what was their big one? N64. So, big innovations really were about 3D, storage. Just going to have a look at my little mind map here from last night. Okay. There's also, if you want to get down here a bit, there was this whole category called handheld. And there's been a ton of handheld devices. I mean, I have a friend that collects them. And there's crazy ones that you used to be able to, way back in the early 90s, you could, I think it was called Lynx. You could actually hook the 2 machines together and sync them and play against each other, which was really awesome. It was really kind of the first great multiplayer, but it was so hard to execute and do that nobody did it. And it came and it went. But really the first, does anybody know what the first popular handheld device was? I'll give you a hint. It sold 150 million units. Yeah. Sorry, Game Boy was 118. And why would in a world of graphics that were a little bit better and color coming in and all this, why would anybody buy a Game Boy? Does anybody have a sense? Yeah. Play anywhere. And also, interestingly enough, this is where Nintendo was really brilliant, they didn't try and create the exact same games for mobile as they did for console. You know, you go back and you look at the N64 games, it's probably the top 8. But the big sellers, they're all Nintendo's own games. And they're really, really nicely crafted games, which interestingly enough, are super accessible games that pretty much anybody can pick up and play. And they dominate. You know, you have all the other games ported over to those platforms, but, you know, they're way, way, way down here. You know, there were games like pretty original games like Goldfinger, which was really the first console multiplayer shooter game. Now, you play it all together, but people spent endless hours, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, learning what it means to play a multiplayer first-person shooter. And you were all on the same screen and you had a little thing, but you know, when PC comes along a little while later and we start having the first multiplayer first-person shooter experiences on PC, you know, visually they're really great quality. And the fact we can now connect through the web and play people who aren't in the room with us. I mean, I can remember the first time, probably, what was it, Doom for me. It was magic. Like, I'm playing real people, and I don't know where they are, and 3D, and I can run through these seemingly huge spaces. So it was a big leap forward. So now let's jump forward a few years, and I'm going to put mobile up here too.
Is mobile really the same thing as handheld?
Nope. Well, because when we think about numbers of mobile units, you know, we start to use the B word. Things, you know, there's more than 1 billion smartphones out there that are game capable. Within 2 to 3 years, there'll be more than 1 billion tablets out there. And the reason I differentiate, they have lots of similarities, is because in most cases, people are not buying the devices primarily as a gaming device.
It's not dedicated gaming hardware as opposed to handheld.
Yeah, you buy a handheld device, you're buying it for a sole purpose. And this is what we'll hopefully get to. This is the conversation I'm interested in having, is when we project out where the world's going, you know, one of the things we see that's really obvious is you could theoretically, you know, I've gone on business trips where I've realized I've got 8 different devices with me. You know, it's like, okay, this is a little overkill. You know, when you start thinking about recharge plugs and then you go, I just want everything in one place. But I do this here, I do this here, I do this here. So simply for the reason that a tablet is not primarily, for most people, a gaming device, I would differentiate. But I think where that takes us in the future is going to be extremely interesting. We'll get to that. So I'll try and zip through this quickly. So PlayStation begats PS2. New guy on the block comes in, Xbox. N64 becomes GameCube. Am I doing it backwards? No, it's GameCube. PC, still PC. Handheld, I think we moved to, what was it called, the DES? What was that next? The DS. Now the DS, that sold 150 million units. Now largely, I'm not going to, it'd be too confusing at this point and really tax my memory, but there is a certain regionalization to some of these platforms and devices. You know, some of the handhelds did incredibly well in Asia in later years and not so well here, vice versa. Like, I was amazed when I actually went back and I looked at Super Nintendo numbers. Super Nintendo numbers were almost all North America. They hardly had any penetration in Japan.
It was the Famicom.
Sorry?
It was a different name entirely.
No, but even as the Famicom, the numbers, the early penetration rates, behaviorally, they hadn't gotten into the idea of household gaming. It was a cultural issue. But it did shortly thereafter grow and became huge. So big innovations here. Now this, I'm going to assume people have had some experience with all these. What do these platforms bring us? Well, certainly these two. They brought us better graphics. I mean, if you go back and you look at a PlayStation 1 game now, it's low polygon, slow frame rate. It looks like all these games I thought I loved. I go back, whoa, that's like a slideshow.
The Xbox really pioneered Xbox Live. I think that was a big innovation on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they both had mobile, right? PS2.
Yeah, and it was I would categorize Xbox multiplayer usage as being kind of niche in the beginning, but it built the foundation and the understanding, and it showed the power and the potential. I can remember early PlayStation 2 games. We worked directly with Sony in Japan. We were building SSX to launch with the platform in Japan, which launched before here. And we talked about doing multiplayer, some sort of online, and they were not really at all interested in that. They didn't think that was important then. Within another year or 2 years, it was starting to become more relevant, but even then it wasn't anywhere near a must-have feature. I can remember we were doing the second iteration of NBA Street, and as a group we collectively decided, well, there's a bunch of other features that are more important than online, and took all the online out. I mean, imagine doing that today. Yeah, it's a great shooter. We don't need online. Just let them play at home. You had better graphics. To some people, myself included, you took a huge leap on sound. So, things like Dolby came in, and the opportunity for this to really become, again, and if I had more room, I would parallel more things down here, like screen size. If you look at the average screen size somebody had in their house for, a PlayStation 2 game was bigger, bless you,
Thank you.
than it was PS1. And people were starting to get surround sound. And people were starting to create these little home entertainment areas, or in some cases, to genderize it, man caves, person caves. And so sound was relevant. I don't think it was a thing that people would say defined that generation of games. Now, PC, I think this is really about the time that multiplayer games took off. And I really think it took off with shooters. And this took off a lot faster than this took off in terms of people playing multiplayer. And that's something that really built the foundation for, I think, what changed a lot of gaming going forward. So if you jump forward, and I'm going to clearly run out of space because I'm already into 04. So let me erase a few years. So, wow. You didn't sneeze on that when you sneezed, did you? So now we've got PS3. Come on, name them. What else we got? Yeah. Yeah, I guess we skipped the Wii, didn't we? It's in the gap. I'm going to leave that out for now. And the only reason I'm going to leave it out is I think Wii did actually have a huge impact in the market in terms of mainstream games and control-less experiences. But I also think it's hit a dead end. So
I was actually going to say that. I think, the Wii, builds a theme that even came from before, and it's basically the controllers. And it started with the N64, I think, where they had the first thumb joystick.
Yep.
And they realized, okay, that's great, let's put it on two.
Yep.
And if we had 3 thumbs, I'm pretty sure we'd have controllers with 3 of them by now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say beyond a doubt when it came to gameplay design and elegance and innovation that really matters around gameplay and user experience, Nintendo's always been so far ahead. And even the Wii. The Wii is an experience. I spent some time working on Kinect and Kinect products. It doesn't hold a candle. There is, I'm pretty sure Kinect's dead today. Although, if you look at the largest selling Xbox 360 title, it's Kinect Adventures. And part of that is it's a pack-in game at some point. So a lot of units are sold because they're packed in with hardware. But to me, and I can take some responsibility for this, but Kinect was a big souffle. And it got heated up, and it seemed like a great idea. And everybody bought into, we're going to control the world like Minority Report. And even when the guy that designed that for the film said, no, that's not a good interface. It just looks good on film. It's true. But in fact, I think what Nintendo did with Wii was, I mean, I played a lot of bowling. I love the bowling game. I love the ping pong game. They created an experience that was really better. It wasn't just a promise. It was good. And it had the feel. It had the nuances. And I think they should be incredibly proud. Although, I do think that particular part of the business, for now, has hit a dead end. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Now, mind you, there's all sorts of new touching and interface that goes along with mobile devices, with touch screens, and I think some of the thinking there may live on in this respect. But I'm going to leave Nintendo because what they currently have out there seems to not be going anywhere, and they still have some legs in the handheld space, but the handheld space is rapidly continuing to be cannibalized by mobile devices, and I think it's going to be a really hard route when you've got a device that costs $500, $600, $700, $800, then going out and spending another $100 or $200 on a mobile device where you can have millions of games available here and dozens of games available there. So what else? I mean, as we think about what we got out of this, we have PSN, we have Xbox Live. Now, clearly, these are both vibrant. I don't think I'm allowed to say what actual Xbox has never said their real live numbers, have they? I don't think they've ever published them.
No.
I know them, but I think one of the 11 NDAs I signed when I worked there would probably cause me troubles. And if I can digress for a second, I read the greatest articles about NDAs the other day. I've been spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and there's an article about people coming in to pitch their game ideas into Silicon Valley. And they were saying, do you need an NDA in place to go pitch your game company idea, your game idea to a venture capitalist? And it was very funny because overwhelmingly, and it surprised me, most people said no. They said most serious investors at a venture capital firm who are looking at 5 to 10 deals a day, multiply that out by a week and a month, they not only don't want to sign those things, not because they're going to turn around and steal your idea, they don't want to sell them because it creates potential encumbrances when you look at that many ideas. And they actually made a very good case of when you're pitching these things, in most cases, your idea is not so brilliant in its concept itself that they're going to go, hey, I'm going to take that and I'm going to go find these other guys. I'm going to rip them off. I'm talking about legitimate investors, not a lot of the people we see here in Vancouver who create shell corporations. But it was interesting because not just people on the VC side, but a panel of very experienced people on both sides of the equation said, no. If you're lucky enough to get a meeting with a serious investor, don't create an encumbrance by doing that because they might just say, look, forget it, don't share it. And I thought that was interesting because I've always told people, get it signed. It's not a big deal. People shouldn't mind. But this article said very much the opposite. So what else did this generation get us? It got us...
Steve, can I just interrupt you? Online, I found an article said that there are 46 million members worldwide.
It's in the right neighborhood. It's in the right
Oh, no. In December, no, that's right. 46 up from, in December 2010, there were only
Gold or
25 million.
Are they saying gold or gold and silver?
No, registered Xbox Live.
Okay, interesting. Well, this was relevant, and a bit of a slight digression, but one of the things, this will feed right into here. One of the things that this generation of hardware brought us, outside of Xbox Live Arcade, which has anybody ever bought a game from XBLA? Yeah, there's the problem. I have, actually. I have one of my favorite games, Trials HD. Love that game. Really fun. The promise of XBLA was interesting. The promise was, how do we make a small game, sell it for less money, get people to try it, with the idea that people love it, maybe we build a big game. kind of like a feeder system. And also for developers, hey, you know, we don't have to commit $20 or $30 million. We make something, and then people thought about, well, what if we do an episodic game? What if we just launch the first episode, and if people like that, we make the next game? But there's a lot of really good thinking there, and it makes sense on paper, but for some reason, when people came into their Xbox universe, in most cases, they were just used to going and buying the game, spending the 40, 50 bucks, and playing it that way. It is unfortunate because I think it is a good bridge to a whole bunch of new opportunities and development behaviors, because we spend a lot of time there trying to think about how do we create new business models. You know, can we get people starting a game there that looks interesting? You know, you look at how people build games like Minecraft, and you go, can I bring that? We weren't using that as an example at the time, but you know, can you take that, put something small out, get people playing it, get a lot of feedback, see where the interest is, and then bring out the next chapter.
Is that what Apple and trying to do now? We're basically doing with their App Store and Google doing with their store as well.
In what sense?
The mobile stores. Like, so you buy. I know it's quite different than the free-to-play model, but there are at least freemium apps where you want Angry Birds in the App Store. You can get the free one that'll give you a few levels. Then you buy the one for $1, and you want additional levels, and you buy more in-app purchases.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can lower your barrier to starting, and I don't necessarily think it's them consciously, it's really the game creators and the publishers driving those new models. And actually, I would like to get to that fairly quickly because that's where I want to go with this. So let me wrap off here. The other big innovation, obviously we have awesome, multiplayer in both these when it comes to, Call of Duty, or a Halo. I mean, the numbers are staggering. It's almost all first-person shooter. You got a little bit of sports games, a little bit of driving games, but it's first-person shooter. And project I spent a lot of time with at Xbox was imagine 90% of the usage on Xbox Live is first-person shooters. That's great. And people are playing a lot of hours, crazy hours. And that's, you want to see that. You want to see engagement. But it's about one genre and essentially primarily, with a little aside for Halo on 360 and Xbox Live, one series of games. So the idea was, can we spread that usage out? And at the same time, Microsoft was saying, can we turn the 360 into an entertainment box versus a gaming box? So the first big foray into that was Netflix. And for the first time ever, without connecting your PC in some way to your TV, you could stream Netflix directly from your Xbox 360 to your TV. And that changed Netflix's world. It really did. And it's something most people, if you're a gamer, maybe you're aware of it, most people don't realize that's where it started. It was non-exclusive. They had a window, 6 months, a year. But then it was everywhere. You buy a new TV, you can get Netflix. You buy Apple TV, you can get Netflix. You can get Netflix through, you get new Lululemon jacket. You can get Netflix through this. But anyway, it's omnipresent now. How you get it is totally irrelevant. It's just there, right? I get a Chrome stick.
Well, I was just, after you're done this, I was thinking one other thing that these consoles
Please.
added, which was DLC.
Yeah, great.
Something really had.
Yeah, and relatively easy purchasing DLC. Because if we go back a little bit probably to here on the PC side, we started to get add-ons, right? You'd have a game, and then all of a sudden they'd sell an add-on pack. And one thing that's important that I don't want to forget here, it's interesting because a lot of the new business models and a lot of the new behaviors came from PC. Subscription. PC was really the first place, long before there was an Xbox Live. If you look at actual sales numbers on World of Warcraft, they're not that mind-blowing. Because eventually they figured out, let's just give it away. We'll make the money on the subscriptions. And there was that weird time where they were both selling it and charging for subscriptions that they made crazy money per customer. But what they quickly realized is, rather than having 5 million customers, it'd be a lot better to have 50 million customers. Because subscription, we get money every month. And that's where it blew up crazy. And even non-sanctioned behaviors, the fact that people were mining gold and selling it, outside of the game system, it became, for me, the first time that digital assets had real cash value. It was crazy. There were people setting up sweatshops in low cost of labor nations, just churning up gold and then selling it. And I had a coworker, I won't mention his name, although he's the CEO of Zynga now, and was running Xbox, no names, who had a tennis pro he used to take lessons from, not too far from here, who was really into World of Warcraft, and he used to mine gold for him. And he always had, I couldn't because we used to travel, and he goes, yeah, you need gold. I got extra gold. What do you need? I'm like, where do you get all this gold? How do you do that, man? You're busier than I am, and when do you play? It was endless gold. And he finally fessed up, but anyway, no names. So that behavior said to us, you know what? There is a real value to a digital asset, and people are willing to spend money on something that has no physicality. That was interesting. Along the same time, far, far to the west of here in Korea, there's a company who I've actually spent a few years working for later called Nexon, who really pioneered the free-to-play microtransaction game. So they had early games. Oh, God, what were the early ones? Kingdoms of the Wind, I think, was one of the early ones. But where they really blew it up was around a game called MapleStory. And MapleStory then was followed by another one called Cartrider. And these were games. Cartrider was a very arcadey, Mario Kart-ish kind of game. And MapleStory was really an RPG, very simple 2D, free to play, but people were spending money in there on assets. And what it became about, especially MapleStory, was this was a place people just went and hung out. They hung out with people they knew, they hung out with people they didn't know. The idea of cohabitating in a space where there's other people playing live was really appealing. And what they realized was, I think at that time, maybe only about 10% of the people that played actually spent money. But because of that 10%, their ARPU, their average revenue, was high enough that it paid for everybody else, and it made a really nice profit. So their focus was always, how do we either get more money out of those 10%, or how do we grow the 10%? And it was pretty easy. Pretty easy to at least focus, because different kinds of features accomplish different kinds of things. And the idea that somebody was willing, just for social status, to be the person to have the new thing, to go spend money. And they introduced scarcity. Well, there's only 100 of these items. And this is the blue hat that looks exactly like the black hat, but it's in blue now, and there's only 100. Really? Oh, by the way, you don't actually own it. You get it for 90 days. And they did that accidentally. They did that because they were really afraid that if they ever had to shut the games down, because nobody was playing, if you owned something, you could theoretically sue them because you were taking away the user's ability to get to their asset. So they started leasing you things.
Did that game have a market in it, or was it just
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you bought everything through them. And it was interesting because the game actually it's still operating. And it actually does well here, too. It's grown. And you look at it at first, and as a Western game designer, when I first looked at that 6 years ago or whatever, I looked at it, oh, God, that looks awful. Like, who would play that? Well, I learned a lot. And I also learned a lot from a couple of psychologists we brought in. I said, why are people playing this? Like, is there some human need? And this one woman, we had them around for like a month, but she answered in like the first 10 seconds. She went, yeah, people are lonely. Oh, okay. That makes sense. And it was true. This was a place for people to hang out and do things with people they knew and people they didn't know. So anyway, that's a whole nother travel. But what's interesting about it is, as we move, let's just jump ahead a little bit to today. So as we start to think about mobile, I just love saying it like that. Just call it, I'm going to simplify it down into phone and tablet for now. So yeah, that thing, that free-to-play microtransaction model that's rampant today, that started back, here on the PC. Business models jump. And they don't just jump within industries. They leap from, one of the things in my little mind map here, I don't think I can fit it all on here, is I was looking at other trends that are going on that have or potentially will affect how we do these things. The way we consume TV today. So how many of you have a legitimate cable box with subscriptions to premium channels like HBO or things like that? Just curiosity, raise a hand. Okay, so that's 4. How many of you watch Game of Thrones? How the hell do you do that? So, here's the interesting thing. I love the fact, so when I was working with Xbox and we were bringing entertainment to the system, aside from doing ESPN and UFC and eventually the NFL, I was really interested in how to bring movies and TV to the network. So we met with movie studios. We spent months working on ideas for HBO and Showtime. We already had Netflix, but we couldn't affect their thinking. They wanted to do what they wanted to do, and they are very smart at it. If I can tell you the one thing that blew me away most about how Netflix operates is they update. Every day they're trying to make their service better. Every day. And they update. It's shocking if a week doesn't go by where they don't try something new. And they'll A/B test it. If we serve it up like this, how does it work? We'll try it this way and we'll try it this way. And they are really so about online service. They are so fearless about experimenting and trying new things. And it's worked. Their experience is pretty good. In this last year when they started making their own original content, think about it today. What's the difference? Somebody explain to me, what's the difference between HBO and Netflix? Is there a difference in what they are today? Okay, who's got a Netflix subscription again? Okay. What's Netflix today? If you had to describe Netflix to somebody living under a rock, how would you describe it? Okay, so the content would be made up of what?
TV shows, movies, original series, documentaries.
Okay. Who has HBO? Describe HBO.
Expensive TV channel.
How much is HBO for you a month? Do you know?
$4.
$4
Yeah.
for HBO?
Yeah.
How much is Netflix for you? Okay, what's wrong with this picture? She said cheap. You said expensive. You're paying half the price. Are you just cheaper?
2% of the value of $8. I'm getting 2% of the value of the $8 subscription.
So you don't think there's as much value on HBO as there is on Netflix?
No.
And that's because of what?
Scope, size of the content. And also, you can stream some things on HBO. I think it's HBO Go, whatever the mobile service is. But it's not included in your TV channel. So if you're just paying the $8 for the TV channel, all you can do is set your DVR and try to get as much content out.
Oh, so for the $8 you can't authenticate on Go?
Yeah, the $4.
$4.
That's just like an add-on with Shaw.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I would have, if you had asked me that question, I would have thought HBO pricing in Canada is probably around $12 to $14. So that's
You can get a
interesting.
discount because it's like a student plan. My entire bill's only like $80 a month, so.
That's funny. It's interesting. Obviously, the HBOs of the world are terrified about the concept of cable cutting. And interesting part is people aren't cutting cable. Not very many, really. So what people are doing is just spending way more money on entertainment. They're spending the money on their cable. Again, this is 30 years old and up. This is different 30 years old and down. 30 years old and up, it's like, yeah, I'm paying iTunes and I'm watching some movies there. You know, maybe I'm doing it through Amazon. I got my, Shaw subscription, and I'm subscribing to some digital music streaming service. Like, actual money that upper middle class and above people above the age of 30 are spending on entertainment is crazy. It's like beyond what somebody would spend on a car lease payment, and people aren't necessarily aware of that. And because, I call it the platinum age of television, but there's never been this much quality content out and available that breaks out of traditional networks. And I really think, I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the film business, and they're all afraid that, the premium series with, great writers, great actors, because of how it engages you over a period of time, the Breaking Bads of the world are going to become the premium form of entertainment over theatrical. Like, I don't know. It's pretty rare I get the same excitement going to a movie that I used to. I'm so excited about the end of Breaking Bad. Like, I can't wait till Sunday. Like, emotionally, I have so much anticipation. Although I'm extremely excited about the movie Rush that's opening on Friday too, but that'll be done and over in 110 minutes.
Is that one of the reasons why the Hollywood studios are so high on just using the same characters and producing the same stories over and over again? Because they know that there's that. If you have another Superman film, you're gonna have 5 million at least people who just want to see Superman in another film.
Oh, absolutely. The theatrical film business is exactly the same as the game console business in that respect. It's very funny because when I was doing some mapping, oh my God, we're out of time almost. I'm going to jump ahead after this. When I was just doing some mind mapping yesterday, it's amazing when you look at PS1 titles. Like, there were so many more PS1 titles that made up the overall sales. It's spread way more evenly. And then when you get to, up to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 right now, it's the line, you got, Call of Duty doing 25 million units. You sell $1 billion worth of the new Grand Theft Auto in 3 days. And so all of a sudden it's this many titles that are doing like 80% of the sales, and they cost the developers 10 times what they used to cost. A PlayStation 1 game was $1 million to, at the most, $2 or $3 million. Jump to PlayStation 2, 10 to 20 million. Jump to PlayStation 3, minimum 20 million up until 200 million plus. So it's about spend more, lower risk, know there's an audience there. So what's happened is you're not seeing new innovation come through consoles, which to me, if I think about where things are going, you've got PS4, you got XB1. I'm not going to include Ouya. I don't know if that's going to become real or not. They're not innovating. They're not taking risks. They can't afford to. They're like the movie, right? And the idea of, at least, it used to be in the film world, there was independent films. Some of them would crack through. Like, there's a really cool movie opening this week. What's it called? Dawn something. Yeah. And I think that was done independently. That looks like it's going to be awesome, and that'll crack out. And who knows, maybe that'll be a big tentpole franchise 2 years from now, and big studios will be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it.